our donors, the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Foundation, and in particular Morris and Anita Broad and Ann Broad Bussell for their generous support of this, I think, signature series within the School of International and Public Affairs. I knew Byron, since I do IR, I knew Byron long before I read his work, and that's because of Nickel. Dr. Nickel Ray, who is Senior Associate Dean now in the College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Political Science. Because I read with delight his first book, which was a rewrite of his dissertation called The Rise and Fall of Liberal Republicans. It was simply a wonderful piece of work. And Nickel had gone out and interviewed as many of that, remarkable generation of Republicans as he could find, and the insights were extraordinary. So Byron, my introduction to you came from Nickel. Everyone welcome Nickel Ray.
Well, thank you, John. It's a great pleasure to welcome Byron Shafer back to FIU. Byron is the Hawkins Chair, Political Science at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And before that, he was the Andrew Mellon Chair of American Government at Oxford University. As John said, Byron and I have had a personal professional relationship for many years. He was my dissertation advisor, guided me through that, and has been an excellent mentor ever since. In addition, he is, I think, one of the leading scholars of American politics and government of the past quarter century. Byron has published works on a number of topics that I think have become quite definitive, or will be definitive, 10 years from hence. His study of the transformation of the presidential nominating process in the Democratic Party, Quiet Revolution, is still the standard and definitive work on that critically important topic. His book, I don't think anyone else has written or added to what Byron wrote about national party conventions in Bifurcated Politics, his second book. A collection that he edited called The End of Realignment, I think is still one of the best discussions of that very controversial theory available, and he assembled an excellent crew of authors to discuss that topic. And Byron also has written an excellent and somewhat controversial study of Southern politics with Richard Johnston, which I would recommend to any student of that region and its politics over the past half-century. In addition to that, he has worked on changing coalitions in American politics, and a series of works with William Claggett of FSU, and most recently on the American public mind. It's a great pleasure to welcome this senior scholar of American politics back to FIU, and Byron, I hand the floor over to you.
So I have a small set of things that I want to say, in which I hope to sort of dispense offense to nearly everybody. And then this is a nice size to go back and forth on that. So let me do a little bit of formal talk, and then we'll kick it around. This incarnation of the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series actually comes at the intersection of a number of auspicious events. We find ourselves celebrating Shepard Broad, of course, immigrant, attorney, banker, philanthropist, whose Shepard Broad Foundation has institutionalized his devotion to South Florida and his support for a better understanding of public affairs. Its initiatives include support for creation of the School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, at Florida International University, so we find ourselves celebrating SIPA 2 as it begins a long-running effort to coordinate activities at FIU in pursuit of that same understanding of public life in the United States. And we find ourselves in the midst of celebrating, or puzzling over, or enduring. I would never dare to guess your attitude on this one. But we find ourselves celebrating, in some sense, our quadrennial collective effort to select nominees for president of and then an actual president for these same United States. You're surrounded by people, partisans, pundits, roommates even, no doubt. I will tell you exactly how that will come out. I promise not to try to outshot them, though I shall correct some of their worst misunderstandings along the way. What I shall try to do instead is drop our time, the current moment, into the three worlds of post-war American politics, and try to make the first two worlds comment on this world, our world, the third distinct structural era since the end of the Second World War. There have indeed been three distinct political orders in the United States since World War II, distinguished by three diagnostic partisan outcomes. I intend to go in search of the key differences in the underpinnings, the recurrent influences for these, and in pursuit of that goal, that same goal, political scientists have actually ultimately been driven to create three different ways of understanding American politics, each ostensibly appropriate to the dominant influence of its time, so I cannot avoid talking about these scholarly efforts too. Yet the cost of proceeding in that way has been an ironic lack of continuity in the way that political change itself is understood. So what I really want to attempt, ever so briefly, is to address these three different orders, almost different worlds, with the same basic toolkit in the hope that we can accumulate rather than fragment our understanding of the larger contours of American politics. The end of the Second World War seemed in its own time like a major turning point in American politics. There were huge surface disruptions associated with economic and social reconversion, and these did inevitably spill over into politics. If you go back and read the professional commentators, or indeed the social scientists of that time, you will encounter nearly any prediction you can imagine. Yet in our time, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that while American politics might never again look precisely as it did in the depths of the Great Depression or in the depths of World War II, what was effectively the late New Deal era had grown out of both and was destined to last for another full generation before coming apart not in the 1940s, but in the 1960s. The central policy conflicts of this late New Deal era were obvious and inescapable. The dominant conflict continued to involve social welfare. The New Deal had brought the welfare state to the United States, and conflict over its provisions would continue to characterize the late New Deal era. The dominant secondary conflict involved foreign affairs, as the end of the Second World War was followed not by a return to international disengagement, but by construction of the institutions and disputes of the Cold War. If conflicts over these never supplanted social welfare, they could temporarily displace it at any given time. Now, the late New Deal era had diagnostic social divisions to go with these dominant policy conflicts. A politics of social welfare both elicited and was driven by electoral coalitions built around social class. Blue-collar Americans leaned Democratic, white-collar Americans leaned Republican. These coalitions were fueled and reinforced by political intermediaries, also diagnostic of their era, its key organized interests. From one side, union labor increasingly buttressed the Democratic coalition. From the other, and despite the rise of corporate business in the post-war economic boom, it was really small business, not big, that buttressed the Republican coalition. These social coalitions were then connected up to those policy conflicts by two political parties that featured important echoes of an older form of party organization, coupled with strong hints of a newer emerging form. The Democrats retained more of the old, being an amalgam of organized machines in the cities, courthouse rings in the countryside, and growing volunteer organizations everywhere. The Republicans, having been devastated by the Great Depression, were already closer to the new form as an ideological, activist-based operation, though the increasingly skeletal structure of the Republican Party still left substantial power in the hands of party officials. The structure of government itself was not as central to the politics that resulted as it would be in the successor era to the late New Deal. What that structure did imply was substantially different coalitions contesting for the presidency as opposed to Congress. For one party, this difference produced an internal tension involving Northern Democrats with the presidency and Southern Democrats with Congress. For the other, the difference instead pitted Republican Party office holders against Republican Party activists, where the former saw the need to make peace with the New Deal, while the latter still preferred to confront it. Yet this was not to be the dawn of a new order in American politics. It was to be the dawn of a new era, a self-conscious behavioral revolution in the study of that politics. Survey research, with its inherently empirical focus, was coming into its own from the 1940s onward in American society. At the same time, the natural sciences, the hard sciences, appeared to be making great strides in their ability to control the physical world. Social scientists aspired to be part of this scientific revolution, and they found in survey research an apparent means for doing so. Thus, political scientists came to believe, really for the first time, that they had the empirical evidence to explain the structure of the late New Deal era. Though not being gifted with hindsight, they actually thought they were explaining not the nature of this first world of post-war politics, but the nature of American politics for all time. Oh, God save us from social scientists who are always discovering things that have never been like this and will always be like this forever and ever. It's an institutional disease. Only partial predecessors of what would become the American National Election Study were in the field for the presidential election of 1948. But already by 1952, a full-blown national survey that would be a lineal predecessor of the ANES was in fact in the field. Headquartered at the University of Michigan and led by Angus Campbell, Philip Converse, Warren Miller, and Donald Stokes, it reported its first comprehensive results in a landmark study, The American Voter, where these authors championed one central concept that would anchor their explanation of this first post-war world. That concept was, I should have thought of doing this as an undergraduate class, I would make you guess. And Becky would guess right, but I'd tell her she was wrong. That concept was party identification, and it could be assessed through a simple branching question. Generally speaking, do you think of yourself as a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or what? For those who chose Republican or Democrat, this was followed by, would you call yourself a strong or not very strong Republican or Democrat? For those who chose independent, it was followed instead by, do you think of yourself as closer to the Democratic or Republican Party? Figure 1, there it is up above, shows the diagnostic political behavior that resulted. Strong identifiers, the left-hand bar, rarely deserted their chosen party. Weak identifiers, the bar to their right, deserted somewhat more. Independent identifiers, the bar to their right, somewhat more yet. And true independents, the right-hand bar, were just truly blown around. The American voter thus lined out a political world in which partisan self-identifications, largely built upon class coalitions originally formed around social welfare issues, were the dominant organizing factor in American politics. These party identifications were the unmoved mover, they were passed from parent to child, and they imparted a characteristic dynamic to this politics. From one side, a clear majority of Americans still supported the policy core of the New Deal and identified with the Democratic Party, such that unified partisan control of the institutions of American national government in democratic hands was the natural result. From the other side, when foreign affairs was the dominant policy conflict, as it actually was with the first election of the ANES, that first national survey, the Korean War election of 1952, and when the Republicans had a personally attractive candidate for president, as they did with Dwight Eisenhower in that same year, then they could hope not only to wrest away the presidency, they could also expect to sweep Congress along in its wake. If this politics of unified partisan control was nevertheless a moderate and centripetal politics, not a polarized and centrifugal one, it was because the central dynamic of mass politics via party identification occurred within those other key characteristics of the late New Deal world. Liberal Democrats were pulled toward the center by the nature of the Democratic Party in Congress, where Southern Democrats were essential to legislative success. Conservative Republicans were pulled toward the center by the nature of their presidential challenge, where a national candidate who could not draw substantial Democratic support, and here Northern Democratic support at that, would never be elected president in the first place. And then it all came apart. The American political order shifted. The central device for assessing it scientifically stopped working. Given their electoral successes in the old order, it should probably come as no surprise that partisan Democrats attempted to deny this first great post-war change for a very long time. Because the leading device for understanding that order, party identification, had arrived in time to colonize the study of American politics under the old order, political scientists, too, were loath to surrender its and their intellectual power. Yet party identification was not and could not be a device for explaining why Democrats would vote Republican and Republicans vote Democratic. Just as it certainly was not and again could not be a device for explaining why partisan identifiers would create divided government, split partisan control of the institutions of American national government. But that was exactly what happened in 1968, and it was to remain the diagnostic description of American national politics, or rather of its second post-war world, for a very long time. Recurrent split partisan control was to give this new world its name, the era of divided government, though as with its predecessor, it was other characteristics that actually gave the new era its structure, within which split partisan control became the obvious result. The central policy conflicts of the new era were again increasingly and then insistently clear. Old conflicts over social welfare did not go away. If anything, they became more intense. Yet they were joined by new conflicts over cultural values and social life, often on an equal and sometimes on a superior footing. The leading policy conflicts of the old order had been essentially distributional, involving the proper share of divisible goods allocated to various sectors of society. The leading policy conflicts of the new order were essentially behavioral, involving the proper norms within which social life should proceed. These latter appeared first in 1968 as conflicts over the riotous degradation of the Civil Rights Revolution, over extensive student protests around the war in Vietnam, and over the appearance of a self-conscious counterculture more generally. The old standbys, social welfare and foreign affairs, were not displaced, though the latter did change. The Cold War consensus broke down, pushing the parties farther apart even there. Yet this widening split was joined by fresh divisions on what should rightfully be called cultural issues. You know them as well as I do. Criminal justice, abortion, public order, religion, public deportment, patriotism, educational policy, family values, and on and on and on and on. In a kind of chicken and egg relationship, there was an expansive body of new organized interests to go with these new policy divisions, intermediary organizations whose central concerns were essentially cultural rather than economic. For the Democrats, these included environmentalists, peace groups, feminists, homosexuals. For the Republicans, they included anti-abortionists, gun owners, religious fundamentalists, supporters of the traditional family, on and on again in both cases. Yet in the second post-war world, these organized groups were connected up to policy conflicts by political parties which had themselves changed in their fundamental structure. Now, both parties were essentially networks of issue-driven activists, not long-serving incumbents of the formal machinery. Moreover, just to close the circle, these party activists were now disproportionately generated by the newer cultural organizations that increasingly populated the political landscape. As a result, the social coalitions at the base of politics acquired a new complexity, the product of an interaction between those newly consequential issue activists and their established partisan rank and files. Now there was not just heightened inter-party conflicts between what had become polarizing liberals and polarizing conservatives among those who did the work of the political parties. Now there was additional intra-party conflict, an elite mass conflict as well, between party activists and their own putative rank and file. Democratic activists were consistently liberal. They remained liberal on social welfare, that did not change, and they added a strident liberalism on cultural values. Democratic mass identifiers, on the other hand, retained a huge body of supporters who remained liberal on social welfare, but had never been liberal on cultural values, and they were not about to become so. Republican activists were likewise consistently conservative. They remained conservative on social welfare, perhaps becoming even more so, and they added a stiff conservatism on cultural values. Republican mass identifiers, however, retained a huge body of supporters who remained conservative on social welfare, but had never been conservative on cultural values, and they too did not become so. So, there were cross-cutting majorities on economic versus cultural issues at the social base for American politics after 1968. And they were cross-cutting largely because the intermediary organizations for that politics, its political parties and their associated interest groups, put policy programs together in fashions very different from the preferences of large segments of the public. Yet the structure of American government facilitated a simple solution in the face of this increased complexity. Colonize one branch of elected national government with one majority and one branch with the other. Because this inevitably meant one branch for the Republicans and one branch for the Democrats, there was more or less automatically a name for the new politics as well. Split partisan control was its diagnostic characteristic, divided government was its moniker, and the era of divided government had been born. For a time, political scientists tried to make party identification explain this new era too, and not just its predecessor. One of these things will move this. There it is. Got 4 buttons. I got it on the second one. That's still, yeah, that even money I still get. Political scientists try to make party identification explain this new era and not just its predecessor. Figure 2 asserts, there on the top line, an actual Democratic majority in the old order. The red bar at the top for Democratic identifiers contains more than 50% of all Americans. You can see them there, looking back at you. Political scientists then pointed to the rising share, this is the second bar coming down, rising share of those who refused to call themselves either Republicans or Democrats, insisting that they were partisan independents, and offered these people as the alleged root of the new order. Figure 2 confirms that there was an increase in the share of these individuals within the American electorate. This is the purple bar there in the middle, the light purple. It's the growth sector among partisan identifiers, you can see that. And this growth had to mean that the era of reliable, unified, democratic control of American national government was not as secure as it had been since the end of the Second World War. Yet figure 2 is not sufficient, you're already thinking it's not nearly sufficient to produce a new era in American politics. The numbers themselves are way too small. Moreover, the basic idea of party identification was a failure if it was office-specific. Party identification as a motive force was simply gone if you could consider yourself a Republican for the presidency, a Democrat for Congress, and say a Green for governor. Instead, what scholars had to find, we see this by hindsight, though it took those on the ground much longer to see it, was some basis, presumably some issue-linked basis, which could cause people to assert a party identification but then deviate regularly from it in their votes for public office. And what became the solution, the central political science for the second world of post-war American politics, was known as the issue evolution perspective. First articulated by Edward Carmines and James Simpson in a book of the same name, Issue Evolution. This was a focus on new issues that arrived in a form sufficiently powerful to themselves become institutionalized, like the old issues of social welfare, but effectively at right angles to them, creating institutionalized and ongoing cross pressures on their voters. This was indeed what happened, as figure 3 attests. The lines on this figure are the difference in issue impacts on the vote for president versus Congress. As you can see, policy issues in the first period, this is the late New Deal era to your left, did not do much to pull the two offices apart. Nothing much was distinguishing the presidential from the congressional vote, which helped to explain why they moved together in the presidential election years. By the late 1960s, however, that green bulge that begins on the other side of the first vertical line, cultural issues involving the proper role of government in supporting behavioral norms had begun to pull voters substantially more Republican for the presidency than for Congress. This is the green line in figure 3. By the late 1970s, issues of national security, this is the red line in that figure, where the parties now staked out sharply different positions, were pulling voters even more Republican for the presidency than for Congress. From the late 1960s through the late 1980s then, there were in fact major issue concerns pulling voters away from their welfare-based party identifications with one institution but not the other, with the presidency but not Congress. Issue evolution had thus provided the basis for split partisan control of the major elected institutions of American national government. And then it all came apart. Once again, the American political order shifted. Once again, the central device for assessing it scientifically stopped working. I'm almost sorry to pull this right for the second time. It's sort of, makes the story sound even more complicated than I would like it to sound, but not more complicated than it is. But at the peak of its explanatory power, the issue evolution perspective stopped performing as it had for the previous 20 years. And it did so, of course, because the era of divided government had expired. Issues, even cross-cutting issues, hardly disappeared from American politics. Rather, the problem was the opposite. They actually looked essentially as they had for the previous 20 years. Yet from 1992 onward, they no longer functioned as a single, simple explanation of the result. Something major was different, with obviously different outcomes and a different set of ongoing influences to tease them out. The era of divided government had been incipiently in place by 1968, producing a regular pattern of Republican presidency stapled onto Democratic Congresses, with only the one-term Carter accidency as an exception. By hindsight, we can now see that 1992 was different. First, Bill Clinton brought back unified partisan control of American national government. Then, only 2 years later, he was integral to bringing back Republican control of the House of Representatives for the first time since the early late New Deal era. With a single exception of the Clinton re-election in 1996, unified partisan control was to be the new story of on-year elections. Unified control for the Democrats in 1992, unified control for the Republicans in 2000, unified control for the Republicans again in 2004, and unified control for the Democrats in 2008. Active partisans once more denied the obvious. If you know active Democrats or active Republicans, you know they deny the obvious to you at any opportunity. Active Democrats tried to see the George W. Bush elections, both of them, as a blip. Active Republicans wanted to see the Barack Obama election as yet another one-term accidency. Political scientists split into two camps as well. One denying that there was any overall change, and the other asserting that if there was, the old tools could explain it. Though like the activists, both sides among the political scientists were unified in being in denial. Yet just to make this transition odder, these political scientists already possessed what would become their central means for interpreting a new political era. It was just that they had not yet connected it up to the new political world. Nevertheless, there it was, in the form of a burgeoning and multifaceted focus on partisan polarization. As ever, different authors preferred different vocabularies, yet what most were talking about was a two-pronged development whereby active partisans became more ideologically homogeneous within both of the two major parties. Republicans more homogeneously conservative, Democrats more homogeneously liberal. While at the same time, these parties moved farther and farther away from each other. What was additionally different was that the focus of analytic concern in this third world of post-war politics was no longer principally the presidency, but principally Congress. The issue differences that had once distinguished the presidency from Congress in the eyes of the American voter had largely been extinguished, and this was much more a matter of change in Congress than of change in the presidency. Now, as Figure 4 attests, Figure 4 is the congressional vote alone. The same concerns, look at the band on the right, the modern era. Same concerns moving voters in a major way with the presidency, namely social welfare and cultural values, the blue and the green lines, were moving voters with Congress too. This is just Congress. You can see those two issues having major effect on congressional vote. And they were indeed moving the two parties in opposite directions. Once, these parties in both houses of Congress had contained substantial, ideologically moderate, even ideologically dissident minority factions. Now, the liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats of that previous era were effectively extinct, while moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats appeared as increasingly endangered species. Perhaps surprisingly, there was general scholarly agreement about the sources of this contemporary polarization in the form of two major changes to the ongoing structure of American politics. The first was the disappearance of the solid South, that anchor of what could have been described in the late New Deal era as the American three-party system: National Republicans, Northern Democrats, and diagnostically Southern Democrats. For our purposes, the point about any dominant one-party system is that it has to contain all shades of ideological opinion within it. When a one-party region as large as the American South then aligns with the two-party system common to the rest of the nation as a whole inevitably becomes more ideologically polarized. Yet while this regional change in the fundamental nature of American politics was underway, a second fully national change was underway as well. This was a shift in the nature of both political parties, from formal machinery built around organizational service to social networks built around issue activism, where internal party fortunes were largely determined by an ability to capture the policy concerns dominant within this stratum of partisan activists. This second change had been underway beneath the surface during all of the era of divided government. By 1992, it had fully captured the activist strata in both parties. Active Democrats from around the nation no longer differed much from each other. It's stunning for somebody who's old enough to remember the old world to discover that you can sit in a Democratic Party meeting in Minnesota and it's really not any different from a Democratic Party meeting in Mississippi. And Republicans, of course, the same. By 1992, these altered activist strata had also more or less fully captured their partisan representatives in Congress, the sitting Republican and Democratic congressmen and senators. There were still scholars who clung on to party identification as the key to interpreting this third world of post-war American politics, despite the fact that what this key would have done, had it been determinative, was of course to restore the late New Deal era. There were still scholars who clung on to issue evolution with its cross-cutting concerns as the key to interpreting American politics, despite the fact that what this key would have done, had it been determinative, if it could still be used as a simple overlay on top of party identification, was to sustain the era of divided government. And if it works the same and that's all you need to know, then it didn't change. What I want to suggest is that it's time to step back, stop replacing one allegedly central explanation of the current world with another, and try putting them all together in a way that could have been used at every point across the post-war period. Though to do this, we have to take one further analytic step. Contemporary students of partisan polarization largely agreed, albeit some happily and others not, on what they saw as its main implications for the modern era. The clustering of each party around a narrower and narrower ideological core, and the movement of these two cores away from each other. And the handful of graphics that I'm about to show you are in one sense entirely in conformity with that view. Yet while those engaged in the polarization argument stop there, you and I must go on to notice a second major effect of these changes. This effect, when added to party identification, the central tool for explaining the first world of post-war American politics, and when added to issue evolution, the central tool for explaining the second world, just may allow us to see the contours of the third world, our world, your world even more than my world in many cases in this room, the modern era in American politics. Let us then take three simple examples of partisan polarization. First between the sexes, then between social classes, and then between moral foundations. Figure 5a tells the story of men, women, and presidential voting since 1952. In the old world, the late New Deal era, the first set of dots on the left, men were more Democratic and women more Republican. This partisan difference disappeared in the 1960s, that second pair of essentially overlapping dots. And in the 1970s, men and women began to separate in the opposite fashion, men more Republican and women more Democratic. And the result was destined to become a huge gap. The size of that gap is the standard story of polarization. But note an equally important, frequently overlooked second effect. Partisan polarization was almost entirely a product of the behavior of men. Women voted no more Democratic. It was just that men voted much more Republican. Polarization was thus not an equal opportunity employer. It was a one-way benefit to Republicans, at least when seen through the lens of sex. Figure 5b tells the story of family income instead, by income terciles, that is top, middle, and bottom thirds of the income distribution. The figure suppresses the middle third in order to hammer its point, but I assure you that the middle falls neatly between the top and the bottom. In the old world, the late New Deal era, again the pair of dots to the left, the rich were more Republican and the poor more Democratic, but not by all that much. This was, after all, a period when most people were Democrats, full stop. This income gap, like the sex gap, broadened out in the 1970s, and this, too, is conventionally treated as the full polarization story. But again, note that what has really happened was that the Democrats remained essentially flat in the bottom third by income, while the Republicans gained about 10 percentage points in the top third. Polarization is not an equal opportunity employer. It is a more limited but still clear benefit to Republicans when seen through the lens of family income. And then figure 5c finally adds the story of generic religiosity, the intensity of religious practice. Again, there's a small middle category that's dropped to heighten the comparison between regular church attenders and regular non-attenders, but together these do make up more than 85% of the total population. This time, and opposite to the income story, there was little to say through the 1980s. Those two dots just aren't very far apart in the 50s, the 60s, or the 70s, and indeed through the 80s where they overlap. Religiosity had nearly nothing to do with partisan voting, and then its influence exploded. On the one hand, there was a Democratic gain among the irreligious this time. You see the Democratic line going up, not just the Republican line going down, to go with the Republican gain among the religious. And while there are more of the religious than of the irreligious, the latter are actually growing faster. On the other hand, the Republican gain from even this aspect of partisan polarization was still much larger, and this larger gain was happening among what remains the larger population. Polarization is not an equal opportunity employer. What does it all add up to? My research assistant told me that he read this carefully and he said it added up to too many moving pieces. I hope that's not true. What should we say about the political order of the modern era, our era? What is the ongoing structure of American politics in our time? Not all the dots are visible, in my view, but if we connect up those that we can see, the resulting picture looks something like this. The balance between the two parties within the general public is closer than in the late New Deal era or the era of divided government. A democratic edge remains, but it can be compromised not just by cross-cutting issues, but even by voter turnout. Next, the active political parties are just as clearly farther apart than in either the late New Deal era or the era of divided government. It would have been theoretically possible for the two to move closer together as they became more closely balanced, but that is not what happened. I'll spare undergraduates in this audience the rant about all the theories that said as they became more evenly balanced, they had to move closer together. All I'll say is that is not what happened. Next, the share of those who reject a partisan connection is no longer rising, but in an era of greater party balance and of partisan polarization, the voting influence of those who reject a partisan connection continues to increase. It takes fewer switchers to move partisan control of national government in a major way in our time. Next, the resulting over-responsiveness by the party system to limited shifts in voter preference or even in voter turnout simultaneously creates a greater potential for public disappointment with the most recent partisan change, whatever it was, Republican or Democratic. You can be sure that whatever happens next time, it will take people less time and more people will move faster with repulsion of whichever candidate wins the presidency and whichever group carries Congress. We have built that in. And next, and finally, moreover, there remain major policy realms that cross-cut the old social welfare basis of the party system without having managed to replace it. Cross-cutting issues are thus a continuing incentive to generate those limited voting shifts that result in over-responsiveness by the party system that have an augmented impact on partisan control of government. Let me say the same thing differently. We had unified partisan control of American national government in Republican hands in 2004. We had split partisan control with a Republican president and a Democratic Congress in 2006. We had unified partisan control of American national government in Democratic hands in 2008. And we had split partisan control with a Democratic president and a Republican Congress in 2010. The last time something analogous to this happened was in the 1840s. Get used to it. And since I've already told you more than I know, God knows what we'll do with the questions, but let's do something with the questions. Stunned silence. You never know. Adrian, get unstunned.
What would you say are the cross-cutting issues for this new third world that you see?
Well, I mean, mostly they remain as they were, which is to say that the economic and cultural issues give you but you've now got sort of wild cards that are cross-cutting both parties in different ways. Immigration is a lovely, sort of right down the middle of both parties. Both parties have, there's a sense in which Democrats are now there isn't even a sense of that. There are just two wings in each party, and you know who they are. And it's sometimes when you listen to the activists, you would get the sense that Democrats are pro-immigration and Republicans are anti-immigration. And hey, but when you look at the mass numbers instead, the parties of the grassroots are just cleaved by that one. And they're cleaved in a different way from the economic and cultural sort of dominant issue basis of the previous system. In an odd way, the environment works that way too. Environmentalism is more perverse in that it's like wife beating. It's very hard to find people now who want to call themselves anti-environmental. But certainly in Pennsylvania, where I grew up, it's not hard to find people who think that it would be nice to use more coal. And that environmentalists are overprivileged, wealthy, blah, 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 latte sipping, truly are an evil bunch when you see them getting together. But basically, the underlying cross-cut is much the same, but you got a set of additional and apparently rising further issues. Immigration really is the nicest example that don't fit that cross either.
Byron, you mentioned the impact of the realignment of the South. But I noticed your final discussion, you didn't pay much attention to regional effects. So I'd like to get your views on that, if they're worth looking at. And second, you know, the sort of counter-realignment, if you like, of the North and Pacific, which has also been quite marked since the Reagan era, where much of the Northeast and certainly the Pacific states were presidentially competitive and not Republican leaning. And now, you know, bluer than blue. The three Pacific states, much of them, and certainly the Northeast. It's very hard to think of more than one state in New England, one or two states in New England and the Middle Atlantic, and no Pacific state that would go Republican this fall.
Okay, there's several questions embedded there, so as I answer the first and forget the middle one, you just bring it back. I'll bring it back. We'll do something with all of it. If you have to do this for a doctoral dissertation, or even for a senior thesis, you will have to develop these tables in a kind of South, non-South way to reassure people like Dean Ray that it's not just the South that's doing the whole thing. That everything else would be cold oatmeal if you looked at the non-South, and that it's, hey, this is a Southern story where the South is wagging the dog. But in fact, by about 1980, you don't need to bother with the South, non-South cut. The South is, of course, more culturally conservative than the North. But that's the point. I mean, and in fact, when you start to look at, so the great religious families of American politics, think of them as evangelical Protestants, mainstream Protestants, Catholics, and non-Christians. By our time, evangelical Protestants in Georgia are identical to evangelical Protestants in Maine. The difference is that they make up 65% of Georgia and 6% of Maine. And so, if you're in Maine and you're the evangelical candidate, you get all 6 of them. But there's 94 that are missing, and the world gets tougher and you need to do something else. But in Georgia, it'll do. But you don't have to bother, from about 1980 on, you don't have to bother with South, non-South. Before that, you really do have to have the Southern story playing and a national story, and the South and the nation interacting in the South, but outside the South, never mind. It's just the national story. Because both trains are running in the South, but only the rise of cultural issues and the cross-cut of economic issues is rising in the North. And then it says, there's always some wise guy. What about New England? What about the coasts? Isn't it all just pivoting the same way someplace else? And there are pieces of that in the sense that the great example, 1948, the first 1952, 1948, I'll make sure I get it right so we don't screw it up. 1948, the first of the post-war elections. What is the most Republican state in the Union in terms of its presidential vote? Well, somebody knows.
Maine.
Close, Vermont. Good guess. And what's the most Democratic state? 1948. South Carolina. Mississippi gets picked off by the Dixiecrats, and otherwise it would be a great guess. By 2000, what's the most Democratic state in the vote for Al Gore? Vermont. And what's the most Republican state in the vote for George W. Bush? South Carolina. And you could treat this as regional movement, but I don't think you should. I mean, I think by then you ought to treat this as a combination of economic and cultural preferences. You get to Vermont, and you're in, or California. I mean, the Lord will punish California, and let us hope that it's soon. You are among sort of cultural liberals, and you got this. This is playing. California hasn't become the sort of Marxist party of America. I mean, this is not a state where you're trying radically to raise taxes. This is not a state where you're trying to sort of control the means of production. But this is a state that's culturally very liberal. And as that has come into politics and become more important, it has, of course, become more democratic. Because the Republican Party isn't providing much comfort for those folks. And, you know, you get to South Carolina, there's still an awful lot of people who could make use of basic social welfare programs, as long as you don't have to be pro-life or pro-choice in order to do it. But as you bring that on the dial and make it more important too, it gets much harder for the one axis to dominate the other. And you don't, I mean, there is an interesting regional story because of what's going on here, but region is no longer driving the story. It's the values of the people who live there that are driving the regions, or at least this is today's line.
Byron, arguably what's happening in Figure 5C here is not only a change in the behavior of religious voters, but also a change in religious voters. Evangelicals specifically. And the change I have in mind is compared with the first part of the century, in which to be evangelical was to retreat from the political.
Right.
Right. By mid-century was, but especially at the time, exactly the time that this chart identifies, to the embrace of the political. So what I'm wondering about is what that says about the theme that you started with about party ID. Arguably, that embrace of the political creates a new ideological basis for partisan identification. So you said get used to it, but I wonder for how long we should get used to it as that trend progresses, or do we move back to one of the other systems?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to walk off that cliff, Paul, because one of the sub-themes of this lecture is that people find one thing, they grab it, and they drive it for 40 years, including 20 years past when they should have let it go. But yes, I mean, part of what you see, I mean, the bubble pictures don't tell you much when you're doing men and women because they're 50-50 and the bubbles don't move. Here, the size of the bubbles is the share of the electorate that's in the categories. And so you got two big things going on here, not just the irreligious becoming more Republican and the practicing becoming more Democratic, but the black bubbles are growing and the white bubbles are shrinking. They haven't yet swapped places. And then, I mean, if I had to write this as a book instead of a lecture, I would just steal what you've been saying and say, you know, in fact, some of what's going on with those evangelicals is the South. I mean, is the movement, evangelicals are disproportionately present in the South. As the South joins the national party system, they are finding themselves Republican. Some of it is indeed, however, what you're talking about. I mean, it is when you don't mobilize religion into politics, then those evangelical Protestants are indeed the poorest of the four religious families. And social welfare will hold them very neatly in the Democratic orbit. I mean, never mind the South. If the only issue in politics is social welfare, and you're mainly the people who need it, it's going to be very hard for you. It's going to be very hard for me to lure you away. But once you bring that issue in a major way, then those folks are first cross-pressured and then gradually sort of offended out of their old party. That's in some sense not captured by the bubbles at all, but it's very real. Cleone.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about something that may be reinforcing the kind of polarization we're seeing in this figure, specifically the role of the media. And by that, I don't just mean cable news, but book clubs that cater to particular groups, listservs, websites, Twitter, and other things that basically form these sort of informational enclaves where people go to have their opinions reinforced rather than exposing them to alternate points of view.
I'll talk about it, although you'll see expose the flaw in what I'm going to say to start, which is to say that at some point, the chicken and egg argument here becomes really desperate. And so, on the one hand, the things you're introducing are very important to the modern world in terms of the polarization argument. And people who study mass media will talk to you about how, there's a great line from Bucky Covington's A Different World, which I would sing to you, and people would immediately leave. But it talks about an era in which there were 3 TV channels you got up to change. When there are 42 instead, those 3 are not forced to the center as much as they once were. And on the other hand, you're not all being exposed to a kind of centrist view that pulls conservative Republicans in and liberal Democrats in. You can now find somebody that's most comfortable for you. Indeed, I have no doubt there is a socialist vegetarian channel out there someplace. And if you could, God knows if there's a shopping channel. The shopping channel subspecializing in a jewelry shopping channel. So you can find a sagebrush rebellion channel out there that is good only in Wyoming. And people who study media and communication are actually, they started out being charmed by this. The argument not very long ago is, isn't it terrible that American media is so bland and centrist? And there are all these other points of view out there that aren't being represented. It hasn't taken 20 years from the same people to wring their hands and say, now you never hear anything except what you and your wife say to each other at night at home. I mean, you never get a second idea never goes into your head because you only watch the jewelry shopping channel and you sort of, you don't even know what the guys who are shopping for cars are doing. And it never causes any tension for you because, so there is surely mass media are both more partisan than they were in the era of divided government, and certainly in the late New Deal era, and the dispersion of the partisanship that's reflected in mass media is surely wider than it was in the middle period, which was in turn wider than the early period. But some of that must be technology. I mean, some of that, we have to write some of that to technology, and not to sort of politics as we conventionally think about it. Certainly not to parties. But, some of it is there are, as you get polarizing activist populations, which I'm treating as not statistically dominant, and I think that's right, but are not small. Most people here are living in a university one way or another. You're very used to populations of committed Democrats and committed Republicans, and they may not dominate your world, but there are a lot of them. And so it wouldn't be surprising if a more technologically dispersed and able media found populations like this to talk to. I mean, you got to have the idiots who I try to read only the AP Wire so as to escape them along myself. But you pick your favorite Democratic flavored or Republican flavored media, and they now have a market out there. When there were 3 channels, that was suicide. But now, and so once they carve that market out of the other news sources, then the other news source has to look around for something different. What do we do to keep our numbers up? And so it's, but sort of, I'm not, I don't have a strong, I don't have a confident line of argument for which of these, what's the comparative size of the 2 arrows running here? And sort of anyone in here who's looking for a dissertation topic, there it sits. I mean, Diana Mutz has lovely work on this. You can Google Diana Mutz as a start, and she sort of worries in both directions in a very pleasant way. But it's, there's sort of, the risk in saying, yeah, Byron Shafer was here, and what he said was polarization is increasingly institutionalized. And he did say that. But he knows, just as you know, that the previous sort of 50 years of this talk was about people who institutionalized an explanation finally by the time when it stopped working. And it's can I imagine, you know, make immigration fly as bigger than either economics or culture. And suddenly those polarized parties have to reshuffle the pieces. I mean, it's sort of make yourself a committed conservative Republican who will not vote for an anti-immigration candidate. And make yourself, you know, a committed Democrat who will not vote for a pro-immigration candidate. And there's, you know, there's 15–20% of the electorate lives there. There's no problem finding a mass base for that. Some social groups are overwhelmingly there, and they're overwhelmingly Democratic. Make that definitive. And we got to shuffle the pieces just like that. And even the media then have to, you know, the answer is, you know, you got these new, you got MSNBC or Fox News or whatever your favorite bête noire is, and they're positioned wrong. And they'll each have a few commentators who try to make this work and twist themselves into a pretzel. But they'll have to rework it. If you can make that work, they'll have to rework theirs.
Yeah, I was just wondering how you saw the one man, one vote decisions in the Supreme Court and how that sort of fundamentally restructured the way districting is done and sort of shook up the parties. And this all occurs in your second era.
Yep.
And I was just wondering how you, if you could comment on that a little bit and just maybe how that would play into this explanation.
Okay. There's a piece of it that I never thought of. There's we're used. There are people who dismiss a large part of my middle round of explanation by saying, you know, it's all incumbency. All you're talking about is what happened to incumbents who left. But that's all it is. And I've done the work to show you that that's not all it is. That change in the middle period happens faster with open seats than with incumbent seats. But if you look only at the incumbent seats, it's still happening. It's still running in the same direction. The same kind of Democrats are picking up culturally conservative, Republicans picking up culturally conservative, Democrats culturally liberal. Not as fast, but that's all. But here's, I've never tried to get into the Paul asked about fitting in the actual politicization of the evangelicals rather than just the question of where they belong when you bring them into politics. I've never thought about squeezing the realignment years, which do come sort of 1964 and on.
Yeah.
And off the top of my head, but I'm prepared to, I'm certainly happy to have you invite me back in 6 months when you discover this is wrong. Off the top of my head, I would think that the reapportionment revolution is a mild break on this rather than a facilitator. I mean, you start to take away seats in the areas that are most likely to switch parties. You take away, especially rural areas, which are those areas are most likely to move from rural Democratic areas are going to move Republican, but you're shrinking their seats. And so I suspect that when you put that into the sausage machine here, that this argument is understated rather than overstated. But I have to just say I don't know.
I had a question about religiosity. When you look at evangelicals, how do you break down that community? Because if you look at black evangelicals, Hispanic evangelicals, you'll find different correlation
Yes.
in which you do a white evangelicals. And also, on religiosity, what about non-Christians who are very religious?
Right.
Differences like Muslims.
Yeah. Let me take the last part of that first because it's easy. In the current world and for much of the post-war period, the evangelical Protestants, mainstream Protestants, Catholics, by which Catholic we also mean Eastern Orthodox, and non-Christians works easily because the three big pieces of non-Christian are atheists, Jews, and others, and the others is tiny. And so it turns out there's a world of difference between atheists and Jews in lots of theological ways, but in terms of their politics, you don't harm much of anything by lumping everybody as non-Christians, because they end up doing the same sort of thing. If you actually start to have a lot of Muslims in the non-Christian category, the category's not going to work, because they are not doing that. This is economically moderate and culturally very conservative territory, and it doesn't look like the others. So far, there aren't enough in national samples to make the categories a problem. Although, if you were then interested in Muslim Americans, the fact that there aren't enough in those samples would be a real problem to what you were working on, because you couldn't, you saw them and you saw them growing, you couldn't get at them. I've surrendered to my professional colleagues on the more important question of evangelicals. In my head, there are 4 great social cleavages that we've thought about traditionally and that we sort of should keep thinking about. One of these is social class. One of these is race and ethnicity. One of these is religious families or denominations. And one of these is sex or gender, which again, I'm so backward that I think is sex and not gender, but here we are. But those who do religion and politics at the mass level all make a further distinction between white evangelicals and black evangelicals. And I understand why they do that, because indeed the political behavior of the two groups is sharply different. But what I believe to be the case is that, and I've in a book called The American Political Landscape, he said, advertising, which will come out sometime in the next year, I give in to them and I divide the evangelical population into black evangelicalism, in part because I've begun to be convinced by colleagues that the themes of black evangelical Protestantism, the Exodus, the various forms of social revolution and social self-realization, they're just different from white evangelicalism. And liberation theology themes, I'm sort of yielding to that. But I'm struck by the fact that when you look at, when you rank these now 5 populations, split evangelicalism, white and black, when you rank them from culturally conservative to culturally liberal, there's no difference within evangelicalism. I mean, the evangelicals are just the cultural conservatives. You don't need a race cut there. But when you cut them on economics, the black evangelicals and the white evangelicals are at opposite ends of the continuum. And what I think one wants to say there, but you hear a man learning and working his way through this, is that among the white evangelicals, you can make not just economic but cultural values pay you at the polls in a big way. But among black evangelicals, you can't. And that, in fact, I am, because I'm committed in a talk like this to the belief that lots of things can happen over time, I don't regard that as a permanent condition. But I mean, even within the 2 evangelical churches, you can see remarkable parallel movements across the post-war years in terms of the people who are culturally conservative, morally traditionalists. Think of these things as moral foundations. Think about the evangelical Protestants as being closest to the notion that we are governed by received values. You are not free to decide what's good and bad. People who are free to decide what's good and bad are what we know is immoral. You are moral to the extent that you are forced to do things that you don't want to do because they're right. And the evangelical Protestants are the great embodiment of received morality, just as those non-Christian populations are the great embodiment of you ought to figure it out for yourself. You ought to think what's good, what's bad. You ought to sort of blah, 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 blah. But if you look at the movements within evangelicalism across the post-war years and how the sort of church hierarchy has begun to think about economics, the effects are often actually quite parallel, which is to say, it used to be the case that when white evangelical Protestants were out of politics, they didn't deal with the New Deal. They didn't deal with social welfare. They just dealt with moral traditionalism. Moral traditionalism told them to stay out of politics. End of story. But when they're in politics, they now got to deal with economics too. And so thinkers begin to think, what is it about evangelicalism that would make you an economic conservative as well as a cultural conservative? And they began to think about it a lot. And you can see it happening among white evangelical Protestants in surveys across the post-war years. They become more economically conservative. And you can see it happening among black evangelical Protestants. The difference is that when you start out voting 95% Democratic and 5% Republican, you can be moved a further 5% toward the Republicans. It still isn't worth anything. Whereas when you're an evangelical white Protestant, you start out being 50-50, and you move 10 points, so you're 40-60. The effect is massive. And so, that's sort of the answer. Thank you.
But the story here isn't just about white evangelicals, because I mean, it includes Catholics,
Right,
religious
oh,
Jews.
yes. All right. Now, when you go to religiosity, you get out of that.
Right, so you know, if we're looking at this from sort of your first
Yep.
world,
Right.
it would be Protestants versus Catholics, rather than sort of saint versus sinner.
Right. Well, when you look at denominations instead, there is something quite different going on here. If you think about the late New Deal era by denominations, the late New Deal era really is, and we all forget this, I don't know why we forget this, we know this, really is the world of the Protestant nations. Now, this is the world of Protestants versus Catholics and others. This is the world in which poor Protestants vote Republican and rich Catholics vote Democratic. I mean, the world of God save us from the Kennedys, but the world of the Kennedys, I mean, the answer is, why are they Democrats? Because they're Catholic. And because being Catholic, you're barred from all kinds of things. And why are all those poor Protestants, sort of dirt poor farmers all across the Great Plains and into the West voting Republican? They're Protestants. And that world in our time has gone away. Mainstream Protestants and Catholics have largely converged on each other in terms of their values and their voting behavior. And what sits out on the wings now is the evangelical Protestants on the right and the non-Christians on the left. But that didn't used to be the case. The evangelical Protestants and the mainstream Protestants used to be clustered against the Catholics, with the non-Christians as a sort of barnacle on the tiny barnacle on the larger ship. And then it gets, it's sort of implicit in your question too. When in our time, of course, it gets trickier and trickier because you want to be careful in what you're saying. It used to also be possible, when you talked about Catholics, you were talking about a coalition between Northern European Catholics and Southern European Catholics and Eastern European Catholics. When you talk about Catholics in our time, you come to Hispanic Catholics very quickly. And so that still larger but declining share of European Catholics in American politics and Hispanic Catholics in American politics look different. And then you go inside Hispanic Americans and you also see an overwhelmingly Catholic population, but one where the growth religious sector is in evangelical Protestants. And so these, if we had denominations instead of religiosity, these are not static things. I mean, they're rather dramatically in motion in our time. So that if somebody says, I mean, you tell me what the internal religious breakdown of Hispanic Americans is 20 years from now, and I can tell you some more about what their politics are going to look like. But I just don't know what it's going to look like. I mean, I don't know what the breakdown is going to look like, what the background is going to look like from which you're going to ask me to predict something.